The story begins by introducing a group of Russia's most notorious high-class convicts, most of whom have already been sentenced to death. Among them are murderers, robbers, and even psychopaths. They are undergoing an inspection in the office of the prison warden, unaware that they are actually part of a secret government experiment. The Russian government aims to determine how long humans can survive under extreme conditions. To achieve this, these convicts will be sent to a remote, uninhabited island with a brutally cold climate, where survival is anything but guaranteed. A few days later, the prisoners are gathered at a dock, ready to be transported to an island located in the Arctic Circle. However, none of them are aware of their exact destination. All they know is that they are being ordered to board an old naval vessel, joining other equally ruthless inmates. One of these prisoners is Jilin, a quiet and obedient man who follows orders without question. Yet, as he steps aboard the ship, he realizes a disturbing truth. These prisoners are nothing more than livestock being herded into a pen. Moreover, with no guards monitoring them, chaos erupts in every corner of the ship. The tension reaches its peak when a blonde-haired inmate named Shapanov starts provoking the others. His words enrage Jilin and his fellow prisoners, igniting a wave of anarchy. Throughout the journey, the inmates continuously hurl insults and taunts at each other. Imagine the worst criminals being placed together without strict supervision. The inevitable result is violence. Those locked in opposing cells argue relentlessly until, at last, the cell doors are unlocked. It doesn't take long before the most brutal among them begin to kill each other. Fortunately, the prison officers manage to suppress the riot just in time, and the prisoners finally arrive at their destination, a desolate island that will now serve as their new home. Upon arrival, their hands are bound, and they are forced to kneel before the guards. Shortly after, representatives of the Russian government arrive to explain the purpose of their mission. The prisoners are informed that they are now participants in an experimental program known as Terra Nova. Under this program, they will be required to survive on the island for 3 months. While on the island, the government has provided them with basic necessities, including thick jackets, a stockpile of food, and simple shelters. However, one crucial detail is made clear. There will be no guards stationed on the island. The prisoners will be monitored only via satellite, and officials will intervene only if absolutely necessary. Rather than calming the prisoners, this revelation sparks outrage among them. They feel like mere test subjects in a cruel government experiment. One inmate, Moryak, quietly picks up a large stone and hurls it at the soldiers. This sudden act of aggression forces the combined forces of prison officers and military personnel to retreat. Before leaving, they leave behind a single small boat for emergency use. Then, in a final act, they throw hundreds of keys onto the island. Keys that the prisoners can use to free themselves from their restraints. This instantly triggers another frenzy, as the inmates scramble to claim the keys for themselves, each one determined to seize the upper hand in their brutal new reality. Due to the chaos over the keys, one of the most powerful inmates, Ali, ordered his men to suppress the struggle. With ease, Ali asserted his dominance, forcing the other prisoners to submit to his authority. Once the situation had calmed, Ali declared himself the leader and demanded that everyone show him respect. However, this display of power angered Jilin. While the other prisoners bowed to Ali, Jilin openly rebelled, sparking further resistance among the inmates. Meanwhile, a group of prisoners boarded the small boat and approached a floating communication buoy, an important device meant to contact the prison authorities. But instead of calling for assistance, they destroyed it. Back on land, chaos still raged. After Ali and his followers were killed, the remaining prisoners quickly raided the supplies left by the government. Jilin, who had his own plans, searched for necessities such as food and a thick jacket. His cellmate, Pukovnik, even handed him a knife for self-defense. Once he had gathered everything he needed, Jilin chose to leave the prison camp. Wanting a more peaceful life, Jilin distanced himself from the colony and ventured into the treacherous, icy cliffs. Eventually, he discovered a cave that was noticeably warmer than the rest of the mountainous region. Having lost both his wife and Chuan, Jilin decided to take shelter there. However, his rest was soon interrupted when he awoke to find that his food supplies had been devoured by rats. Frustrated, he lit a fire to keep himself warm. With no food left, he was forced to rely on his survival instincts. Later, Jilin began hunting seabirds to quell his growing hunger. At one moment, Polkovnik managed to track him down. Overjoyed to see Jilin alive, Polkovnik admitted that he had assumed Jilin had perished. Starving, Polkovnik begged for food. At first, Jilin refused to share, but Polkovnik offered him a stolen packet of table salt from the government supplies as a trade. In return for his generosity, Jilin agreed to share his meal. But food was not the only thing Polkovnik sought. He pleaded with Jilin to let him stay, explaining that he could no longer endure the brutality of the prison camp. Understanding his plight, Jilin allowed Polkovnik to live with him in the freezing mountains. The next day, the two of them set out to fish along the frozen shoreline. The frigid seawater made fishing incredibly difficult, so Jilin suggested they move elsewhere. During their search for a better spot, Jilin stumbled upon the wreckage of a crashed plane stranded in the icy mountains. At that moment, a revelation occurred. Jilin was a former pilot. Seeing the remains of the aircraft reignited his desire to escape. Determined, he resolved to repair the plane and use it as a means of escape. Later, the two men returned to the cave where the temperature had plummeted drastically. They quickly built a fire to keep warm, but the worsening weather signaled an incoming storm. Realizing the danger, Jilin woke Polkovnik and urged him to return to the camp. However, just as they were about to leave, Polkovnik was overcome by the extreme cold, nearly collapsing from exhaustion. Thanks to Jilin's quick thinking, he managed to save Polkovnik, and together they made their way back to the camp, which had now been transformed into a settlement by the prisoners. However, upon closer inspection, it became clear that the conditions in the settlement were horrific. Moryak, who had taken control as the leader of the prisoners, divided them into two groups. The first group consisted of the elite prisoners, his loyal followers, including Shapanov. The second group was the oppressed prisoners, treated no better than livestock. This division was nothing more than a way to satisfy Moryak's sadistic nature, as he was a true psychopath. Along with his inner circle, Moryak forced the oppressed prisoners to participate in a deadly game called Dead Whisper. This was a twisted race where the losers were executed and their bodies were cannibalized by the victors. Meanwhile, Jilin and Polkovnik arrived at the outskirts of the camp, where they found some supplies. Their plan was to take whatever they could and return to the mountains. However, Polkovnik stumbled upon freshly cooked food and assumed that some prisoners had been feasting on beef. Exhausted from his recent bout with hypothermia, Polkovnik was drawn to the warmth and comfort of the settlement. With this in mind, they decided to stay there temporarily. Unfortunately, this decision turned out to be a grave mistake. Before they could leave, Moryak's men found them and prepared to execute them alongside the other victims of Dead Whisper. Just as it seemed all hope was lost, a prisoner from the oppressed group named Yakut stepped forward and tried to defend Jilin. However, his act of defiance only fueled Moryak's rage, and he too was brutally beaten. Later, the captives were then forced to join the ranks of the oppressed, marching with their hands behind their backs and ordered to wear absurd, exaggerated expressions for Moryak's amusement. Once again, the prisoners were thrown into the deadly game. None dared to resist, knowing all too well how merciless Moryak could be. As the game commenced, the terrified prisoners focused only on survival. One by one, the losers fell, begging for mercy before being executed. But in this brutal dictatorship, there was no place for compassion. Only the law of the jungle reigned. That night, Jilin began to rally the oppressed prisoners, urging them to fight back. He believed that the dead deserved to be buried with dignity, not consumed like animals. Jilin called upon his fellow prisoners to rise against Moryak and end his tyranny. The next day, as usual, Shapanov summoned the oppressed prisoners for another round of Dead Whisper. However, he was completely unaware that Jilin and his allies had already set their plan into motion. The act of rebellion forced Moryak to emerge from his stronghold. Jilin then seized the opportunity to approach him with an offer. He claimed he could repair the communication buoy and request food supplies from the government. Naturally, Moryak was skeptical, especially since Jilin had been stirring dissent among the oppressed prisoners. In a desperate attempt to persuade him, Jilin revealed another secret. He had found an abandoned airplane and was planning to fix it. If successful, Moryak could use it to escape the island. Intrigued by the proposal, Moryak agreed to the plan and allowed Jilin and his group to set out for the buoy in the middle of the freezing ocean. Meanwhile, the Dead Whisper game was postponed as everyone eagerly awaited the results of Jilin's repair work. However, as soon as Jilin reached the buoy, he and his companions realized the harsh truth. The buoy was beyond repair, and there was no hope of receiving aid from the government. Back at the settlement, the oppressed prisoners had reached their breaking point. Led by Yakut, they launched a vicious attack against their oppressors. Bloodshed ensued, and many prisoners perished in the uprising. However, Moriak still managed to hold on to power. When Jilin and his team returned, Moriak confronted them, expecting good news. Unexpectedly, Jilin boldly declared that the buoy had been successfully fixed and that a military base had been contacted, ensuring an imminent food supply. But Moriak was no fool. He immediately saw through the lie. Just as he was about to act, one of Jilin's comrades, Tolya, gripped the screwdriver they had used for repairs. Watching Moriak mock Jilin with cruel laughter, Tolya seized the moment and drove the screwdriver into Moriak's body, ending his reign of terror. With Moriak dead, the power dynamics shifted instantly. Zilan and his allies launched a final assault on the remaining elite prisoners, eliminating them one by one. At last, the oppressive regime was dismantled, and the system of cruelty that had ruled the settlement was no more. After Moriak and his gang were defeated, Jilin finally admitted that he could not contact the government because the machine was completely broken. This meant they had to find another way to survive in such a harsh place. News of Moriak's death was soon announced by Tolya, prompting the prisoners to cheer, as they were finally free to live as equals, rather than being treated like livestock. Not only that, Tolya also declared that their next mission would be to repair the wrecked plane stranded on the cliffs. Under Jilin's leadership, the prisoners eagerly gathered plane parts and transported them back to the camp. Not long after, the prisoners were shocked by the sudden arrival of government officials bringing supplies. Representing the government was a woman named Martha, who immediately summoned Jilin to hear a report on the experiment. However, Jilin had little interest in discussing the experiment. Instead, he used this opportunity to request fuel, claiming he needed it to power the electricity turbines, though in reality he intended to use it as fuel for the plane. Additionally, Jilin reported that he sometimes had to eat sea creatures other than fish, as fish were scarce in the area, which visibly surprised Martha. The most important outcome, however, was that Jilin successfully obtained the fuel and immediately began testing his newly found aircraft. Before leaving the island, the government had assigned the military to transport a new group of prisoners from America, significantly increasing the population. As the newly established leader, Jilin attempted to welcome them, but the newcomers rejected his authority and sought to seize power for themselves. This sparked a new wave of violence, forcing Jilin to fight for control once again. At the military base, Martha received reports from her subordinates that the prisoners were once again killing each other in a struggle for dominance. Many of the guards and soldiers sympathized with the prisoners, recognizing the extreme conditions they endured. As a result, they pleaded with Martha to put an end to the experiment. After coordinating with higher authorities, she ultimately decided to terminate the project. To ensure no evidence or witnesses remained, Martha ordered the military to execute all the prisoners, effectively erasing any trace of the experiment. Fortunately, Jilin was saved by Tolya amidst the chaos. They managed to return to the hangar, where Polkovnik and another prisoner, Arzanovsky, were waiting. The four of them planned to escape, but Polkovnik chose to stay behind, having his own undisclosed agenda. Respecting his decision, Jilin left Polkovnik behind and took off in the plane with Tolya and Arzanovsky. However, their escape took a tragic turn when they had to fly over the military base. The aircraft came under heavy gunfire, killing both Tolya and Arzanovsky. Despite the devastating loss, Jilin had no choice but to keep flying, leaving the nightmare behind. And with that, the story comes to an end. Moral lesson from the story: if you're ever trapped on a frozen island full of criminals, remember, teamwork makes the dream work, unless the dream is eating each other. And remember, leadership is important, but on an island full of murderers, it just means you're the first one everyone wants to kill.